Thank you all for being here, and I know it's at the end of the day. I'm going to try to keep things moving. So my talk, I couldn't have set it up better than Dr. Dorn did. Thinking about the work-life balance, thinking about passion, thinking about creating a niche. Those are all critical, life skills that are probably more important than, or just as important as the science that we're studying. So it's really important to also take care of ourselves physically, mentally, and, just do the best that we can. So I'm going to start with a brief history of my journey so far, and then go into a little bit of kind of my research journey. So this title kind of describes my research program in general. Okay. So as Dr. Soliman said, I started in Michigan. I actually did my undergraduate at Michigan State and my master's degree. And then I emailed him randomly out of the blue, asked to meet with him to talk about a PhD program at the University of Michigan. And we had the first conversation, and I remember driving back to Lansing, wishing I could just move to Ann Arbor the next week and get started. But that was the beginning of my journey, and my first course in epidemiology was actually back at Michigan State, and what struck me was the story of the pump handle in London and how that one physician was able to stop an epidemic by tracking the source of contaminated water, and just by doing that one thing, he did more to enhance people's health and prevent mortality than he had been doing, his entire life as a practicing clinician. So I thought, that's exactly what I want to do. I'm interested in looking for, sources of disease and mortality and intervening at the population level. So I completed my PhD at the University of Michigan, and I think I was really fortunate to be there at a time where there was a very strong social epidemiology program as well as a strong cancer epidemiology program. So in terms of building your niche, I think I was able to strike that balance in thinking of health disparities and health equity and apply that to the concept of cancer epidemiology. I was initially interested in actually doing HIV research, but funding was available in cancer research with Dr. Soliman. So in terms of take advantage of opportunities, I'm glad I was flexible enough to not say it had to be HIV or anything else, because it turns out I actually love doing cancer research. I had opportunities to work globally. I've been back to Nigeria a few times to work on projects. Some worked out, many of them didn't. And, again, being, steadfast and not giving up is very important, because, if you keep going, something will work out eventually. So I went to Columbia for a postdoc when I graduated. And while there, the team there was really strong in epi methods and molecular epidemiology. So I was able to add a new layer to my training, adding to the social epidemiology and the cancer epidemiology, and starting to think more about the biology underlying, cancer disparities. Then I got my first faculty position at UAB in 2014, where I was as a new junior faculty, I wasn't quite sure what to do and how to do it and what was going to work out. So I was doing a little bit of everything, trying to figure out how I was going to define myself as a junior faculty, doing a lot of secondary data analysis to generate hypotheses, along the lines of building on the training I had already received. So that was a really good, valuable experience, and I was fortunate to be in a department with a strong chair and lots of resources, so I didn't feel I had protected time my first 2 years that I did not have to teach. So I was really able to take time and think about what I wanted to do and start writing those grants and keep writing the papers. And so I got my K1 award my second year at UAB. Then I moved to the University of Kentucky after 3 years at UAB to start a new position as an associate professor, and what really sold it for me were two things. One was the opportunity to contribute to kind of building the diversity of the college and celebrating diversity in the college, and also that there is a very highly ranked cancer registry at the University of Kentucky. So all the data that I had been trying to get and pulling things together at UAB, I had access to all the data, really good quality data at the University of Kentucky. So I made that move. And work-life balance is critical. I had my first son at Michigan in the middle of my dissertation. And there was a time I told Dr. Soliman, like, yeah, I need time off, I can't do this. So I took 6 months, had him, did all that, and then came back when I felt I was ready to go on, and had my second son, still doing the dissertation. And so I left Michigan with my degree and 2 kids. And then moved to New York City for a postdoc, which was hard. So, those will always be the most challenging years of my time, but just, important to take time for yourself and take care of your family and retain that passion that was mentioned. So in terms of my research, like I said, I started with, the interest in cancer epidemiology is constant, but I started at Michigan with that social epidemiology aspect, learning from Anna Diaz-Rue and Sandro Galea and other people about socioeconomic status and access to healthcare and how those influence cancer, both cancer risk, screening, mortality outcomes. And so a lot of my dissertation project and a lot of my early work focused on the role of socioeconomic status defined based on several different variables at multiple levels and how those contribute to disparities that we observe in cancer outcomes. So in terms of those work, what I was really interested in assessing was the nature of the association between socioeconomic status, healthcare access, and racial disparities in cancer outcome. So is it racial differences? Is it something that's inherently different by race that we're looking at, or is it this added layer of socioeconomic and access to care disparities? And if we can measure those and show those outcomes, those are things that we can actually intervene on. So I wrote my dissertation based on that topic, and my first paper from my postdoc was a review paper on the association between socioeconomic status and breast cancer incidence and mortality, again, just showing that we can see that regardless of how you define SCS, there's a clear association with breast cancer risk and mortality, although in different directions. The association with breast cancer risk is not what we would expect, because we tend to see that higher socioeconomic women were more likely to have breast cancer. But I also borrowed a lot from the work of Dr. Krieger, who's at Harvard, and she has done a lot of work actually thinking about disparities in health and the socioeconomic contributions. And so this result here was a natural experiment that she did, which was very simple but elegant, and I still go back to this slide all the time, where she was looking at trends in black-white differences in ER-positive breast cancer in the US. And if you can see from 1992 to about 2002, there was an increase in AR-positive breast cancer in the odds ratio, but then there was a decline after 2002. And on the right, she broke it down by age group. So you can see that the increase and the decrease actually was strongest among perimenopausal women. And so the conclusion of that was that, the observation that well-off women were more likely to develop breast cancer may be tied to the fact that around 2002 was the result of the Women's Health Initiative study that showed that hormone replacement therapy was actually associated with adverse health outcomes. So we saw that increase that coincided with increased use of hormone replacement therapy. And once the publication came out, we saw that decline, especially in the age group of women that were more likely to use hormone replacement therapy. So the point she was trying to make is that there are social factors, which she described very elegantly in this other paper here, that, research looking at racial disparities in cancer shouldn't just automatically assume that the differences are fixed or that it reflects intrinsic biology, but we should also consider other hypotheses that there are societal conditions that shape the expression of the observed biological characteristics. And so just that, using that example as, well-off women more likely to have a known breast cancer risk factor. And once the information came out that it was harmful, we saw that decline. So there are things outside of biology that shape, health conditions and health disparities specifically. So I retained my interest in, thinking not just of socioeconomic status, because it's not really about income. In that previous example, it was more of access to care. So who are the women that were more likely to get hormone replacement therapy? There were people that had access to physicians that could get a prescription. So thinking more of availability of healthcare resources in terms of things that we can define at the county level or the individual level. So here we just used data from SEER. We looked at county level, we looked at black-white differences in availability of healthcare resources. So that was defined very broadly at the county level. We could see differences by race, but it was different from what we were expecting. Because although there were more people there were more black patients that lived in counties with no healthcare insurance, we actually saw that there was a higher number of OBGYN among areas where blacks lived compared to whites. We also saw that even though they lived in areas with more, healthcare resources defined as number of OBGYN, they were less likely to utilize those resources. So that's a disconnect, right? That black patients may be more likely to live in urban areas where there's a higher concentration of hospitals and physicians, but if they're not accessing those resources, then it doesn't show up in terms of improved health outcomes. So we observed that there was no association that we found in SEER data between availability of healthcare resources and cancer outcomes among black patients. But if you look among white patients, we'll see that the more healthcare resources that was available, the better the health outcomes. So the lower the proportion of late-stage diagnosis and the lower the mortality. So just showing that there's a disconnect and, we can't just think broadly about those things. It's always beneficial to dig a little bit deeper. And continuing my research into the social epidemiology of disparities was this observation that when you stratify by treatment completion, we actually see that there was this is ovarian cancer data, that there's no survival difference among blacks and whites among people that complete treatment. So it's not that, black patients have a different type of cancer than white patients. It's that probably they are less likely to receive treatment. And this is work done by one of my postdoc mentors, that in the US, when you look at cancers that have established treatment guidelines, those are termed amenable cancers, cancers that have treatment options available. The cancer types that are most amenable, the ones that have the most rigorous treatment strategies, those are the ones where we actually see larger disparities. So as treatment gets better in the US, we actually see disparities widen. Which is what we saw for ovarian cancer. Again, looking at SEER data, we saw that overall ovarian cancer survival improved by 38% between 1975 and 2009, but among white patients, it improved by 43%, and it declined by 27% among black patients. So it's unclear why that trend is going on. And so I was interested in, this seemed like the perfect example of what I've been trying to do, which is look at a cancer type where we know that there are established treatment strategies. We know that for some groups survival is increasing, but what is it about the other group? Why are they actually experiencing declines in survival? So I wrote this grant, which was my dream grant, bringing everything together, using both secondary data and primary data, and thinking about healthcare access in a comprehensive way. It's not just affordability, who has insurance, it's also what's available, is it accessible, does the healthcare facility make accommodations for certain patients, the acceptability gets at some cultural issues that may be going on. And I was interested in looking at this healthcare access, again, comprehensively defined in relation to quality of treatment that's received, both the initial treatment as well as supportive treatment over time. and then looking at that association with survival and quality of life. So these are all things that we know are critical. We know there are marked disparities across all these factors, and basically to try to understand why Black women are experiencing declining survival. So we submitted this in February and received a really good score for the first submission, got scored in the 6th percentile. So it was very exciting that I'm actually going to get to do this. Of course, the hard work starts now, starting with IRB with 7 different cancer registries and getting all that started. But I'm also still interested in the biological mechanisms. Like all the things I learned during my postdoc was about, we can think about disparities as a social issue, but that's not the whole story. There has to be a mechanism through which social factors influence cancer, and it has to be a biological mechanism. So the middle part of my graph here is looking at what if cardiometabolic risk factors, like things like obesity, dyslipidemia, diabetes, that we know also are differential by race, maybe that is the link between these upstream social disparities that we see and differences in cancer outcomes. So I was able to take advantage of a data set available at UAB. So it was an existing cohort designed to look at stroke, but because it was a prospective cohort, I was able to take advantage of that to look at this hypothesis that maybe metabolic syndrome could be a potential biological mechanism that explains some of the disparities that we see in cancer. And the data was small, so the whole cohort was about 30,000 people, but they started recruiting people from age 45, which is still a bit young for cancer outcomes. So we did not end up with, we had less than 1,000 cancer patients in this cohort. So we had some small number issues, but we did see that people that had metabolic syndrome were 22% more likely to experience cancer mortality over follow-up. And we saw that the greater the number of altered metabolic components, those are either obesity, triglycerides, or cholesterol, one of those 5 components that define metabolic syndrome, the greater the number of altered components people had, the greater the risk of cancer mortality. So it was almost 5-fold increase among people that had 4 out of 5 metabolic syndrome components. So those are massive hazard ratios for cancer mortality. And we also looked at specific biomarkers of metabolic syndrome. So we looked at resistin and leptin. And for resistin, in our fully adjusted model, we actually found a hazard ratio of close to 7 for people that had high resistin in association with cancer mortality. So we're finding stronger associations among blacks compared to whites. That coupled with the fact that these metabolic dysregulation factors are more prevalent in blacks, again, potentially could be the link, and these are things that we can actually modify through clinical or lifestyle interventions. So we're planning a grant now to link the whole cohort that I just discussed with cancer registries across the US to obtain cancer-specific information, stage, treatment, so that we can actually break this down by cancer type and look again with the goal of seeing if metabolic dysregulation can explain the disparities that we observe in cancer outcomes. So lastly, because of time, I'm more interested in digging deeper into the biology, right? Because we all know that cancer ultimately is a disease of, is a genetic disease. There's a gene that has been altered, is the ultimate step. But is it possible to link that with, social disparities I've mentioned? Are there genetic or epigenetic factors that are altered through upstream social factors? Does poverty induce epigenetic changes? We've seen some studies that show that is actually true. Can we see some of those metabolic dysregulation factors alter epigenetic mechanisms in a way that's important for cancer? This is something I'm interested in. So I'm looking at metabolic syndrome. I'm looking at the biomarkers of those. I'm also interested in looking at DNA methylation and see if there's activation or inactivation of specific cancer-related genes that may be important. So again, using an existing data set at UAB, I was able to look at the association between metabolic syndrome and epigenetics. So do people that have metabolic syndrome have a different epigenetic profile compared to people that don't. So this was a cohort of African-American adults that were recruited again for something entirely different, and I was just interested as a preliminary step to see what happens. So these figures, the top here is the basic model, and the bottom is the adjusted model. So here we were comparing, again, people that meet the criteria for metabolic syndrome with people that don't, and we found these two CPG sites that were altered among people that have metabolic syndrome. And when we adjusted for other covariate study design factors, the top CPG site here remained significant. We did a replication in a separate study, and it still remained robust. And we found that for both of those CPG sites that we found that were differentially methylated, each of the components of metabolic syndrome, it was actually a significant difference in methylation. Again, just showing that, the metabolic dysregulation can actually induce epigenetic changes. So we looked in TCGA data, which is publicly available, for the gene that remained significant across all our analysis, to see what is known about that in cancer. So this is across cancer data, and we just plugged in our gene, which is the ABCG1 gene, and we found that that gene is actually altered in close to 35% of breast cancer cases, and also significantly altered in other cancer types also. So the gene is a member of ATP binding cassettes, which is involved in lipid transport or cholesterol transport. So we don't. So this is just proof of concept. We don't have we don't have a single data set in which we have people that have metabolic syndrome, that we have epigenetic data on, and that has cancer outcomes. But these different results taken together suggests that there may be something going on here. So, which brings me to my K01 project, which is designed to answer that question. So here we are recruiting breast cancer cases and controls from 5 tertiary hospitals in Nigeria. We had a site in Ghana, but we had to stop that for logistical reasons. And we're recruiting newly diagnosed patients, 350, and obtaining a wide range of demographic, reproductive, lifestyle risk factor data. We're collecting measures of biomarkers, height, weight, of anthropometrics, as well as biomarkers. So we're collecting blood samples, saliva samples. We're also collecting tumor and adjacent normal samples during biopsy. We're also doing extended medical record review of cases. So here there is no electronic system. Everything is on paper, is in files. And Shihua will talk about her experiences over the summer, tracking the files and trying to decipher doctors' handwriting and trying to figure out what's going on. We're trying to collect treatment data and pathology. So we're done recruiting all 350 patients. We've leveraged data from a separate study in Nigeria to obtain data on their 350 healthy controls. So right now what we're doing is in the pathology lab, just characterizing each tissue that we have to make sure that it's actually a tumor sample, and also to figure out what the subtype is. So the main goal of the study is just to, again to look at the association between metabolic syndrome and breast cancer, as well as subtypes. So we're trying to understand if African American women are more likely to have the aggressive triple negative subtype, could that maybe have something to do with metabolic syndrome? And can we identify differentially methylated genes that may explain that association? So that work is ongoing. We're close to finishing. But I'm sure you all agree that it's a very complex problem. I've talked here about specifically about cancer disparities. And there are many, many factors. I've focused on socio-economic status, access to healthcare, and some of the biological factors that may mediate that association. But of course, it's a lot more complicated than what I've looked at here. So I'd just like to say that, I hope it's clear kind of how my experiences have shaped the kind of questions that I've asked, and how it's important to really remain passionate and to be fearless. I think a lot of times people will hear your ideas and maybe not understand or not think it's important, but it's really critical if it's something that you truly believe in, that it's important to be persistent and to work hard and to not let people discourage you and to just follow your passion as has been said. So with that, I will take any questions.
Would you move back to New York? We have 4 faculty positions right now. I'm serious. Would you ever move back to New York?
I think I'm like you. I'm like, I will never go back there.
Well, let me introduce you to our students and Dr. Solomon, and maybe we'll change your mind.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
Oh, sounds good.
The importance of being strong, and Dr. Tomi is one of the very strong people that I have ever met in my life. So in her PhD program, there were several points where her strengths were very evident. And I remember after she finished and she moved to New York for the postdoc position, it wasn't easy. This was like non-stop working, and it needed someone who's very strong. Then I remember when you got your first faculty appointment in Alabama and you emailed me the offer letter, I said, don't take it. And she said, no, I'm gonna take it. So the offer letter was about, we are offering you a faculty position at the University of Alabama School of Public Health. Mm-hmm. Here are the conditions. In 3 years, you need to bring 70% of your salary from external sources. And I said, this is crazy, 70%. She said, I'm gonna take the position, I'm gonna bring 70% of my salary from external sources. So strength is something very important in academic career, and you don't surrender, you don't back off easily. Thanks, everybody.